Montana Territory, 1872. The dust of the trail clung to Yates Young's skin like a second hide as he rode across the sun-baked plains. At 25, he'd already spent 7 years pushing cattle and sleeping under stars that offered no comfort. The frontier had taught him one truth above all others: a man survived alone. Attachments were dangerous. They gave the wilderness something to take from you, and the wilderness always took its due. He nudged his sorrel gelding forward, his weathered hat pulled low against the merciless summer sun. The herd of 200 head stretched behind him, a living river of beef being driven north to the railroad at Helena. 3 weeks on the trail had left his canteen empty and his throat parched as the Montana earth. As the shadow of the Gallatin Mountains stretched across the valley, Yates spotted a modest homestead tucked against a stand of cottonwoods. Smoke curled from the stone chimney of a well-kept cabin, the kind of place he'd trained himself not to yearn for. A home meant roots, and roots meant vulnerability in a land where winter blizzards, summer droughts, and outlaw raids could strip a man of everything in a heartbeat. Water, he muttered to himself, deciding to risk the approach. The cattle would need watering before nightfall anyway. His trail boss had sent him ahead to secure permission, though out here, many ranchers guarded their precious water rights with loaded rifles. As he approached the cabin, Yates kept his right hand loose near his holster, not threatening but ready. The frontier had taught him another lesson: be prepared for anything. What he wasn't prepared for was her. She stepped from the cabin's porch with a rifle balanced confidently in her hands, not pointed at him, but not exactly welcoming either. Her honey-blonde hair was pulled back in a practical braid that caught the late afternoon light, and her simple blue calico dress couldn't hide the graceful strength in her stance. She couldn't have been more than 20 summers, yet there was a self-possession about her that made Yates straighten in his saddle. "That's far enough, cowboy," she called, her voice clear as a mountain stream. "State your business." Yates raised his hand slightly. "Ma'am, I'm riding point for the Circle T outfit. We've got 200 head coming through, and I'm looking to water them at your creek before making camp for the night." Her blue eyes narrowed slightly as she assessed him. "Circle T, that would be Theodore Turner's spread down near Bozeman." "Yes, ma'am, I'm Yates Young, Mr. Turner's trail boss for this drive." She lowered the rifle slightly. "I'm Catherine Ellis. This is my father's homestead. Pleased to meet you, Miss Ellis. About that water." "My father isn't here. He rode to town for supplies." She studied him another moment, then seemed to make up her mind. "Your cattle can water at the eastern bend of the creek. It won't muddy our drinking water that way. $1 per 100 head." Yates blinked in surprise. Most ranchers charged 3 times that amount if they allowed access at all. "That's more than fair," he said, reaching for his money pouch. "And you look like you could use some water yourself, Mr. Young." For the first time, a hint of a smile softened her serious expression. "Wait there." She disappeared into the cabin and returned with a ladle and a bucket of clear water that caught the sunlight like liquid silver. She approached his horse without hesitation, offering up the ladle. "Much obliged," Yates said, taking off his hat. Their fingers brushed as he accepted the ladle, and he was startled by the jolt that simple contact sent through him. The water was cold and sweet, like nothing he'd tasted in weeks of dusty trail riding. "Your hands are steady," she observed as he drank. "Most cowboys I've met can't hold a ladle without shaking after weeks on the trail." "Been riding since I was 12, he said, handing back the ladle. "Reckon my body's used to it by now." She nodded, then looked past him toward the horizon. "Your herd coming soon." "Within the hour." "I rode ahead to secure water rights." "Smart man, last outfit that came through didn't bother asking. My father and our neighbor ran them off with shotguns." Her matter-of-fact tone held no apology. "No way to do business," Yates agreed. "I prefer straight dealing." "As do I, Mr. Young." She paused. "Will you be needing anything else? Food supplies, perhaps?" The trail cook had mentioned they were running low on flour and coffee, but Yates found himself hesitating. Something about this woman unsettled him, made him want to linger. That was dangerous thinking. The trail was his home, not some homestead with a pretty woman and the promise of comfort. "We're well supplied," he lied, tipping his hat. "I should get back to the herd. Thank you for the water, Miss Ellis." As he turned his horse, she called after him. "Mr. Young, we'll be slaughtering a hog tomorrow morning. If your outfit would like fresh meat, we'd be willing to trade." "Beef for pork?" Yates paused. It had been weeks since they'd had fresh meat. "I'll send one of my men over at first light." She nodded, and he couldn't help but notice the way the setting sun touched her hair with gold. "Good day to you, then." He rode away, shaking his head at the strange tightness in his chest. Catherine Ellis was just another settler trying to carve a life from the wilderness, nothing more. But that night, as the cattle settled and the men smoked around the campfire, Yates found his gaze drawn repeatedly to the distant lights of the Ellis homestead. Against his will, he remembered the steadiness in those blue eyes, the confidence in her stance, the simple kindness of offering water to a dusty stranger. Boss, his second, a grizzled cowhand named Harley, interrupted his thoughts. "Something wrong with that homestead. You've been staring that direction half the night." "Just thinking," Yates muttered. "Send Jenkins over in the morning. They're slaughtering a hog, willing to trade for beef." Harley raised an eyebrow. "Since when do we trade with settlers? Turner wants all his beef accounted for at the railhead." "One steer for fresh pork is a fair trade," Yates said firmly. "I'll square it with Turner when we reach Helena." "Whatever you say, boss." Harley's knowing smile suggested he understood more than Yates wanted him to. Yates stood abruptly. "I'll take first watch tonight." He needed the solitude, needed to clear his head of golden hair and blue eyes that had no business lingering in his thoughts. Dawn broke over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Yates had barely slept, his dreams filled with images of a lonely homestead and a woman who stood her ground with a rifle and offered water to strangers. He decided to accompany Jenkins to the Ellis place himself, just to ensure the trade went smoothly, he told himself. The homestead looked different in the morning light, more substantial, more permanent. A large garden stretched behind the cabin, and chickens scratched in a fenced yard. A small barn and corral stood nearby, and a field of what looked like wheat rippled in the morning breeze. It was a working farm, not just a cabin in the wilderness. Catherine Ellis was already outside, feeding the chickens when they rode up. She wore a simple brown dress today, with an apron that couldn't hide the slender curve of her waist. She straightened when she saw them, a smile of recognition warming her face. "Mr. Young, I didn't expect you personally." "Thought I'd check your operation before we trade," he said, dismounting. It was a flimsy excuse, but he couldn't admit the truth that he'd wanted to see her again. "Of course. My father returned late last night. He's preparing for the slaughter now." She gestured toward the barn. "Would you care to meet him?" Yates nodded, following her across the yard. He couldn't help but notice the well-tended garden, the sturdy construction of the cabin, the general air of permanence and care. The Ellis homestead wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. "You've built something impressive here," he said. She glanced back at him, a hint of pride in her expression. 5 years of hard work. We came from Pennsylvania after the war. Father lost his arm at Gettysburg, but he didn't lose his determination." In the barn, a lean, one-armed man in his 50s was sharpening knives with methodical precision. He looked up as they entered, his gray eyes assessing Yates with the same directness his daughter had shown. "Father, this is Mr. Yates Young of the Circle T outfit. Mr. Young, my father, Martin Ellis." Martin set down his knife and extended his remaining hand. His grip was firm. "Heard you were passing through. Catherine says you're interested in trading." "Yes, sir, 1 steer for a portion of your hog." Martin nodded. "Fair enough, we could use the beef." "Planning to smoke most of it for winter." "You winter here?" Yates asked, surprised. Many settlers retreated to larger settlements during the harsh Montana winters. "This is our home," Martin said simply. "We don't abandon it when times get hard." There was something in the way he said it that made Yates uncomfortable. He'd never stayed in one place long enough to call it home. The trail was his home, always moving, never attached, never vulnerable to loss. For the next hour, Yates found himself drawn into the Ellis's world. He helped Martin and Catherine with the slaughter, impressed by their efficiency. Catherine worked alongside her father with practiced skill, never flinching at the blood or the heavy work. Not once did she act the delicate flower that many Eastern women would have played. "You handle a knife well," Yates observed as she butchered with precise cuts. "Necessity teaches quickly," she replied. "Mother died our second year here. I had to learn everything she used to do." "I'm sorry about your mother." Catherine's hands paused briefly. "Thank you, it was lung fever." "Nothing to be done out here." Yates nodded. The frontier was merciless that way. It was why he kept to himself, why he didn't form attachments. Everything you loved could be taken in an instant. By midday, they had finished. Martin invited them to stay for a meal, and against his better judgment, Yates accepted. He sent Jenkins back to the herd with half the processed pork, promising to return before sunset. Inside the cabin, Yates was struck by the touches of comfort amid frontier practicality. Handmade curtains framed the windows, a patchwork quilt brightened a rocking chair, and bookshelves lined one wall, a luxury in the territories. "You read?" he asked Catherine as she prepared a simple meal of cornbread and stew. "Every chance I get," she replied. "Father trades with the freight wagons for books, says an educated mind is as important as a strong back out here." Martin Ellis nodded from his seat at the table. "Catherine reads to me in the evenings. Right now, we're working through Mr. Dickens's latest." Yates ran a finger along the book spines, unable to remember the last time he'd read anything besides trail maps or cattle brands. "My mother taught me to read," he said quietly. "Before she died, I was 10. Catherine paused in her work, her eyes softening with understanding. "And your father?" "Never knew him. Grew up with my uncle's family in Kansas until I was old enough to ride for wages." The simple meal turned into hours of conversation. Martin Ellis had stories from the war, tales of building their homestead, observations about the changing territory as more settlers pushed west. Yates found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did, sharing his own experiences of cattle drives and frontier towns. When he finally rose to leave, the sun was already slipping toward the mountains. "You should stay the night," Martin suggested. "Dangerous to ride alone with darkness coming on." Yates shook his head. "Got responsibilities back at camp. But I thank you for your hospitality." At the door, Catherine handed him a package wrapped in cloth. "The rest of your pork," she explained, "and I added some fresh bread." "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," she said simply. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Yates felt something shift inside him, like ground giving way beneath his feet. Dangerous, he reminded himself. Attachments were dangerous. "Thank you, Miss Ellis," he said formally, breaking the moment. "Your kindness won't be forgotten." As he rode back to camp in the gathering dusk, Yates told himself he was being a fool. 2 more days and the herd would move on, leaving the Ellis homestead and its golden-haired daughter far behind. That was the way of the trail, always moving, never staying long enough to risk your heart. But the next morning, he found himself riding back to the homestead, telling himself he needed to check if they required anything else before the outfit moved on. Catherine was in the garden, her hands deep in soil, when he approached. She looked up, surprise and something else flickering across her face. "Mr. Young, I didn't expect to see you again. Wanted to make sure you and your father were satisfied with the trade," he said, dismounting. "Very satisfied," she replied, brushing dirt from her hands. "Father's already smoking half the beef." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with things neither seemed ready to say. "When do you leave?" she finally asked. "Tomorrow at first light. Need to reach Helena before the month ends." She nodded, looking down at her dirt-stained hands. "And then?" "Another herd, another trail," he said, the familiar words suddenly tasting strange in his mouth. "That's the cowboy way." "Is it what you want?" she asked, looking up suddenly, her blue eyes direct. "Always another trail." No one had asked him that before, not in years of drifting from ranch to ranch, drive to drive. "It's what I know," he answered honestly. She studied him for a long moment. Would you like some water before you go? It's getting warm. That would be kind. Inside the cabin, she poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed again, and this time neither pulled away quickly. Tell me about your dreams, Mr. Young, she said softly. Cowboys don't have time for dreams, Miss Ellis. Everyone dreams. She sat at the table, gesturing for him to join her. Even cowboys. Perhaps it was her directness, or the quietness of the cabin, or simply that no one had ever asked before, but Yates found himself talking. He spoke of childhood fantasies of his own ranch, of land that belonged to no one but him, of building something that would last. But the frontier's no place for permanence, he concluded. Everything here is temporary. The land takes back what you build sooner or later. Is that what you truly believe? Catherine's voice was gentle. That nothing lasts. It's what experience has taught me. She reached across the table, her hand hovering above his but not quite touching. Then you've had the wrong experiences, Mr. Young. Before he could respond, the door opened and Martin Ellis entered, carrying firewood. He nodded to Yates without surprise, as if finding him at his table were an everyday occurrence. Staying for supper? Martin asked. Catherine makes a fine rabbit stew on Thursdays. Yates should have declined. He had responsibilities at camp, preparations for tomorrow's departure. Instead, he heard himself accepting. That evening stretched into one of the most pleasant Yates could remember. Martin told stories of life in Pennsylvania before the war, and Catherine played a small fiddle as darkness gathered outside. When Martin excused himself to turn in early, claiming his old wounds ached, Yates knew he should leave as well. Instead, he and Catherine sat on the porch, watching stars appear above the mountains. "Will you come back this way?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "After Helena." The honest answer was no. The trail would take him south to Wyoming next, then perhaps to Texas for the winter. He'd likely never pass through this valley again. "I don't know," he said instead. She nodded, accepting his non-answer. "If you do, you'll always be welcome at our table." The night air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. It was peaceful in a way trail camps never were, settled in a way Yates had convinced himself was impossible on the frontier. "I should go," he said finally, standing. "Early start tomorrow." Catherine rose beside him. In the moonlight, her face held shadows and questions he wasn't brave enough to answer. "Safe travels, Mr. Young," she said, extending her hand. He took it, meaning to shake it properly, but something in her eyes stopped him. Instead, he held her hand gently, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and determination. "Thank you for your hospitality, Miss Ellis," he said formally, trying to rebuild the wall between them. She smiled sadly, as if seeing through his attempt. "Thank you for stopping to ask permission for water. Most cowboys wouldn't have bothered." He released her hand reluctantly and stepped off the porch. At his horse, he looked back. She stood framed in the cabin doorway, a picture of frontier strength and grace that he knew would haunt his dreams. As he rode away, Yates tried to focus on tomorrow's drive, on the responsibility of the cattle in his care. But his thoughts kept returning to a small homestead with books on the shelves and music in the evening air. Dawn came too quickly. The cattle were rounded up, the chuck wagon packed, the cowboys mounted and ready to move. Yates gave the orders automatically, his eyes repeatedly drifting toward the Ellis homestead, barely visible in the distance. "Ready when you are, boss," Harley reported, bringing Yates' attention back to the task at hand. "Move 'em out," Yates commanded, turning his horse north. They'd gone perhaps 2 miles when he heard hoofbeats approaching rapidly from behind. Turning, he saw a rider pushing a horse hard to catch up. It was Catherine, her hair loose and flying in the wind, her dress inappropriate for riding astride. Yates signaled for the outfit to continue, then waited as she approached. "Miss Ellis," he said when she reined to a stop before him, her chest heaving with exertion. "Is something wrong?" "You forgot this," she said, extending a small package wrapped in cloth. Yates took it, confused. "What is it?" "Open it later," she said, her cheeks flushed. "I just wanted to make sure you had it." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Yates felt the walls he'd built around his heart tremble. "Catherine," he began, but she was already turning her horse. "Safe travels, Yates," she called over her shoulder, using his given name for the first time. Then she was galloping back toward home, leaving him with more questions than answers. It wasn't until that evening, camped by a stream 10 miles north, that Yates remembered the package. Unwrapping it in the privacy of his bedroll, he found a small book, a collection of poetry by someone named Tennyson, and a handwritten note. "For the long nights on the trail, everyone deserves beauty, even cowboys. See." Something cracked inside Yates' chest. He ran his fingers over the note, seeing in his mind the determined set of Catherine's chin, the kindness in her blue eyes, the strength in her hands as she worked alongside her father. For the first time in years, he questioned the path he'd chosen. The endless trails, the temporary connections, the deliberate isolation he'd maintained to protect himself from the frontier's harshness. 2 weeks later, the cattle were delivered to the railhead at Helena. Theodore Turner paid his men, offered Yates another drive starting in 3 weeks, and headed back to his ranch near Bozeman. Yates should have accepted the offer. It was good money, familiar work. Instead, he found himself in a general store, purchasing supplies he'd never bought before: seeds, tools, building materials to be freighted south. "Starting your own place?" the storekeeper asked as he tallied the order. "Maybe," Yates replied, surprising himself with the answer. "There's land south of here, Gallatin Valley." "Good water there," the storekeeper nodded. "Good soil too, if you're willing to work it." Willing to work it. The words echoed in Yates' mind as he rode south 3 days later, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. He thought of Catherine's dirt-stained hands, of the thriving garden behind her cabin, of the determined set of Martin Ellis's jaw as he worked one-handed to build a life from wilderness. The Ellis homestead came into view on a golden afternoon in early September. Yates paused on a ridge, watching the distant figures working in the field, Catherine and her father, harvesting wheat with methodical precision. Fear gripped him suddenly. What was he doing here? He was a cowboy, not a farmer, a drifter, not a settler. He had no right to intrude on their lives, to imagine himself part of their world. He was about to turn away when Catherine straightened, shading her eyes to look directly toward his position on the ridge. For a moment he thought she couldn't possibly see him at this distance. Then she waved. That simple gesture broke something loose inside him. Before he could reconsider, Yates was urging his horse down the slope, toward the field where Catherine now stood alone, her father having moved toward the barn. She waited for him, wheat stalks brushing against her skirt, her face unreadable until he drew close enough to see the question in her eyes. "You came back," she said simply when he reined to a stop before her. "I did," he dismounted, suddenly unsure what to say next. "I read the book." A smile touched her lips. "Did you like it?" "Never cared much for poetry before," he admitted, "but these words, they stayed with me." "The way some people stay with us?" she asked quietly. He nodded, taking a step closer. "Catherine, I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm a cowboy, not a settler. I don't know how to build a home or plant fields or—" "But you want to learn," she interrupted, hope flaring in her eyes. The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities Yates had never allowed himself to consider. "I want," he began, then stopped, gathering his courage. "I want a chance, to see if I can be more than what the trail has made me, to see if there's truth in what you said, that not everything in the frontier is temporary." Catherine closed the distance between them, her hands rough with labor but gentle as they took his. "There's land adjoining ours to the east," she said. "The family that claimed it went back east last winter. It's good land with water rights already established." "You've thought about this," he realized. "Since the day you rode up and asked permission for water instead of taking it," she admitted. "I saw something in you that you perhaps don't see in yourself." "What's that?" "A man who could build something lasting, if only he'd allow himself to try." From the direction of the cabin, Martin Ellis approached, his expression curious but not unwelcoming. "Mr. Young," he called, "decided to take Catherine's advice, did you?" Yates looked between father and daughter, confused. "Sir," She told me weeks ago you'd be back, Martin said with a slight smile. Said you just needed time to realize not everything has to be temporary out here. Catherine's cheeks flushed, but she didn't release Yates' hands. Father exaggerates. Do I? Martin raised an eyebrow. Wasn't it you who insisted we invite him to supper that night, who made me tell all those settlement stories? Yates turned to Catherine, realization dawning. You were trying to show me. That permanence is possible, she finished, even here, especially here. Later that evening, seated at the Ellis table with Catherine beside him and Martin across from him, Yates explained his plans. The land he wanted to claim, the small herd he would start with his savings, the home he hoped to build. It won't be easy, Martin warned. Ranching is different from driving cattle. Winter's harsh here, you'll need help. I was hoping, Yates glanced at Catherine, courage failing him momentarily. She reached for his hand under the table. Yes. I was hoping I wouldn't have to do it alone, he finished, meeting her eyes directly. Martin cleared his throat. Think I'll turn in early. Harvesting takes it out of a man. He stood, gave his daughter a meaningful look, and disappeared into his room off the kitchen. Alone with Catherine, Yates found the words he'd been rehearsing all the way from Helena. I've spent my life avoiding attachments, he said quietly, convinced myself that the frontier was too harsh for anything permanent. That caring for someone just gave the wilderness something else to take from me. And now, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, now I'm thinking maybe the opposite is true. Maybe the only way to survive the frontier is to have something worth fighting for, someone to build with, to face the wilderness alongside. He took her hands in his. I'm not asking for a promise yet. Just a chance to prove I can be more than a drifter, that I can build something lasting here. Catherine's eyes shimmered in the lamplight. Yates Young, I offered you water when you were thirsty, but what you're offering me, it's the life I've dreamed of. A partner who sees the frontier not just as a place to survive, but a place to build a future. Is that a yes? He asked, heart pounding. It's a beginning, she said, leaning forward to press her lips gently to his. Fall turned to winter, and Yates built a small cabin on the adjoining property, riding daily to the Ellis homestead to help with chores and share meals. By spring, when the first crocuses pushed through the melting snow, he had established the beginnings of a small ranch, 20 head of cattle purchased from Theodore Turner, fences marking boundaries, fields cleared for planting. On a warm day in May, with the mountains still capped in snow but the valley greening with new life, Yates Young and Catherine Ellis were married beneath the cottonwood trees where they had first met. Martin gave away his daughter with proud tears in his eyes, and neighbors from miles around gathered to celebrate. Never thought I'd see the day, Harley said, having ridden up from Bozeman for the occasion. Yates Young settled down. Neither did I, Yates admitted, his eyes never leaving Catherine as she moved among their guests in the simple white dress she'd sewn herself. Turns out I was wrong about a lot of things. Harley followed his gaze. She's a fine woman, worth settling for. Not settling, Yates corrected him. Building, there's a difference. As the sun set over their joined properties, the Ellis Young Ranch, as folks were already calling it, Yates found his bride standing alone by the creek where he had once watered a herd of cattle. Any regrets? He asked, slipping an arm around her waist. Catherine leaned into him, shaking her head. None, you. Only that I almost rode away for good, he said honestly. That I almost let fear keep me from the best thing that's ever happened to me. She turned in his arms, her blue eyes serious in the fading light. The frontier takes things from all of us, Yates. It's harsh and unforgiving and sometimes cruel. But it also gives space to build, freedom to create something new, the chance to become more than we were. You taught me that, he said, brushing a strand of golden hair from her face. When you offered water to a dusty cowboy who thought he needed nothing and no one. And you taught me that dreams can come true, she whispered. When you came back and offered me the life I'd always hoped for but never thought possible, a true partnership, here on land we both love. As darkness fell over the Montana wilderness, lights glowed in 2 cabins standing tall against the night. symbols of permanence in a land where nothing had seemed lasting before. Inside those walls were books and music, warmth and promise, and two people who had discovered together that the frontier's greatest gift wasn't gold or land or freedom. It was the chance to build something that would endure, a love strong enough to tame the wilderness itself.